Your Legislators is made possible in part by the generous financial support of MAPE members, making Minnesota clean waters, safe communities, quality education, and veterans care happen. We work hard for Minnesotans. Live from St. Paul, Minnesota, we welcome you to another season of Your Legislators, a roundtable discussion featuring state lawmakers who are prepared to answer your questions and discuss important issues affecting citizens of Minnesota. Now, here's your moderator for tonight's program, Barry Anderson.
Good evening and welcome to Your Legislators. We're delighted that you have joined us on what I think we can now safely say, I think we're by the danger period, a nice spring day here in Minnesota. We have a very special program for you this evening, but it's not composed of legislators. This is Passover and Easter this next couple of weeks. Legislators are at home or around, but in any event not here. And so over the next 2 weeks, we're going to bring you two very special programs. Tonight's program features Legislative Auditor Jim Nobles, and we're going to talk to him a little bit about what he does. But even though he's not a legislator, this is still your program. And we want to invite you to call in with your questions or to send them to us via the electronic means that are displayed on your screen, and we'll see that they get to Mr. Nobles, and we'll have a chance to have a conversation about what the Legislative Auditor does, how he does it, why it's important, and why and how he serves the people of the state of Minnesota. And as I said, this is your program and remains your program, even though we've run the legislators off this week and have a special guest. So let's begin this program, as we do each week, with introduction, in this case, of our singular guest, Jim Nobles. Mr. Nobles, we're delighted that you join us this evening.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you, Justice, and I understand you've given me the privilege of calling you Barry.
It's quite right, and you can use whatever moniker or short form there is appropriate. Tell our viewers a little bit about yourself personally, where you're from, where you went to school, those kinds of things.
Well, I have a past that sometimes confuses people because I'm originally from Arkansas. And yet my family has deep roots in Minnesota. So how did I get from Arkansas to here? I was born and raised in Hot Springs, Arkansas, came to school at the University of Minnesota. And while here, I learned that my great-great-grandfather was an early settler. Nobles County is named for my great-great-grandfather. So it sometimes confuses people when I consider myself a Minnesotan.
You have deep roots here, even if they're indirect.
That's correct. They're family roots, not mine personally. But I've been here long enough that I feel very much a part of this state, and very much appreciate that I ended up here and have the opportunity to serve the people of the state of Minnesota as legislative auditor.
Now, you're going to find yourself, and have in fact already found yourself, sort of knee-deep in the whole MNsure discussion, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But before we get there, I think it would be helpful for our viewers to understand a little bit about your educational background and how you come to be the legislative auditor. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what that auditor does. But go ahead.
Well, I had a undergraduate background in economics, political science, history, and then I went again to the University of Minnesota to what is now referred to as the Humphrey Institute. It wasn't quite that then. It was much smaller and wasn't yet named for the Senator Humphrey, Vice President Humphrey. So I got my master's degree there, and then luckily one of my professors came up and said, how would you like to do an internship at the Minnesota legislature? And I accepted that, and that's where I've been working ever since. And it was a very interesting time when I came to work there. It was in the early 1970s, and the legislature in Minnesota, but around the country, state legislatures, were really changing and trying to strengthen their capacity to participate in government. And one of the ways they were doing that is they were hiring staff, both partisan and nonpartisan. And I went to work for one of the newly created nonpartisan research offices. And then the legislature created, during that time, the Office of the Legislative Auditor. And maybe we'll come back a little bit to that. But I saw that as a real interesting opportunity for me. And so I applied to be the Deputy Legislative Auditor for the Program Evaluation Division, which was newly created. And then a few years after that, the position of Legislative Auditor opened up, and I was appointed to that position. The legislative auditor, by the way, is appointed by a bipartisan legislative audit commission, 12 members of the legislature, House and Senate. I serve a 6-year term, and that's important because the work we do needs a level of independence. And so that 6-year term was really built in to the creation of the office to provide that level of independence. So the office was created, and it now has a pretty long history of providing legislative oversight and accountability for mostly state government.
My recollection is that Minnesota was one of the first to have a legislative auditor. Am I right about that?
Yes, it was a trend going on around the country. Again, it was part of legislatures, state legislatures trying to strengthen their capacity, and one of the things they wanted to strengthen was their ability to exercise legislative oversight. And so they looked at the Congress, and they saw that the Congress had something that we hear in the news often called the GAO, or the Government Accountability Office, often called the watchdog of Congress. And so they really patterned these offices of the legislative auditor after that. Now, when people hear about the Office of the Legislative Auditor, they're sometimes confused, and the names can be confusing. Sometimes people think, well, the legislative auditor must audit the legislature. And that's the one branch of state government that we don't audit because we wouldn't be independent. Our jurisdiction is to audit the executive branch and, Justice, the judicial branch as well. And so then people say, well, what about this other auditor, the state auditor that runs for election? And back when they, created the Office of the Legislative Auditor, they decided to have the state auditor be the auditor of local units of government. So the one thing that your listeners will be able to take away from tonight, and they will be able to answer the ever-present perennial question that comes up at every party, I'm sure. It's a very compelling question, and that is, what is the difference between the legislative auditor and the state auditor? And your listeners will know the answer, and that is the state auditor audits local government, the legislative auditor audits state government.
It's interesting you mentioned the judiciary because, of course, we do have internal auditors who work for the judiciary and look to spot problems in terms of the way money is spent and effectiveness of programming. But, of course, we do occasionally have audits from your office as well, which can, of course, raise separation of powers concerns and the discussions that surround the particular kind of audit and the detail and so forth. Those can get a little interesting. So
they can, and they have come up in the past. I can remember one time in particular when the Legislative Audit Commission, again, that I am appointed by and work for, asked the legislative auditor to do not only a financial audit, but an evaluation of the district court system. And I remember the then Chief Justice came over to the legislature and said, I think you're going to be out of bounds here because that's an issue of separation of powers. Well, we worked that out, frankly.
It was Chief Justice Blatz, I believe.
That's correct.
Yes.
And it's interesting because that evaluation of the district court system ended up having us report to the legislature that the district court system needed more resources. And so that report became one that was often quoted within the judicial branch. It may still be used.
I hear about it from time to time, yes. Your report is well accessed and well read. Well, let's talk a little bit about, we're going to talk sort of more generally about the functions of the office, but I think in the news lately has been the whole MNsure controversy. And obviously you can't talk about specific findings that you might have now or things that are in process any more than judges can talk about cases that might be pending from that standpoint. But you can talk a little bit about the process, I think, talk about how you happen to get involved in this, and maybe give our viewers a little snapshot of procedurally how this is going to unfold over the next several months.
I appreciate that question because it can be a little bit confusing. Let me try to be clear how we got into the various reviews that we're doing. There is a federal law that requires the state auditor, in this case the legislative auditor, to do an annual audit of the major federal funds that the state receives. And the state received a significant amount of money to develop the insurance exchange, now called MNsure. And so that was an audit that we had to do under the federal law, and that's in process. And we're going to be doing other audits, financial audits, under the responsibility and jurisdiction that I have as legislative auditor. But one of the things that I felt was important, given the magnitude of the issues involved, I thought we needed to do a comprehensive evaluation. And the evaluations that we do about 6 or 8 a year. We are asked to do many more, but we only have the resources to do about 6 or 8. That's the one part of the work that we do that has to be authorized through the Legislative Audit Commission, because they take into consideration all the requests that legislators have. And this year, for example, we got 103 requests to do evaluations. And so we have to have a process for sorting through those and trying to determine what will be the best use of the legislative auditor's evaluation resources.
So when you talk about evaluation, you're determining whether a program is effective.
Yes, we're really going beyond just financial audits. Did they spend the money according to the law? But we're really asking questions about management practices, effectiveness, efficiency. And those reports often get to be 90 pages long. I mean, they're quite comprehensive. And so I felt that the issues around MNsure really needed that kind of comprehensive review. We'll be answering some of the questions within these financial audits. But the evaluation that was approved just yesterday by the Legislative Audit Commission at a meeting will give us an opportunity to go much broader and much deeper. And so we'll be addressing a lot of the issues and questions about the website, what went wrong, how the governance structure there was working, issues about the advertising, was that effective, about some of the outreach efforts. That report probably won't be available until probably the end of December or so, because it is a very comprehensive evaluation. But some of the other audits will be available soon.
And I think that's an important point that you make there, and one that we maybe should emphasize again, because, of course, in a hypersensitive political environment, in case anyone was wondering, there's an election in November, and various people are on the ballot, and the timing of this report and how long it takes and so forth is driven not by any of those sort of outside characteristics, but rather what does it take to get the work done?
Absolutely. In fact, I think it's important to emphasize that once we receive the assignment from the Legislative Audit Commission, for example, with the MNsure audit or evaluation, as well as others that we received yesterday, then it is completely within the control of the legislative auditor to decide who's going to be on the team, what the methodologies are going to be, our findings, our recommendations, and when we release the report. And when we release the report really is determined solely by how long it takes us to do the work. And it is typical that when we receive these assignments to do evaluations in the spring, we release the report in December. So it's not taking into consideration the election. It's taking into consideration how long it's going to take us to do a good job.
And this kind of comprehensive report in your past experience is, you're looking at 9-10 months to complete it.
That's correct. We typically put a group of evaluators together, 2 or 3 staff people, and then that's all they will be doing for that period of time, because we get into a lot of different issues. And we have a group of generalists. I have a staff of about 14 evaluators. I have a staff of about 40 financial auditors, but quite a small evaluation staff. And they look at everything from special education to a report we released just recently on whether or not the state should be using asphalt or concrete to rehabilitate roads.
What did we conclude?
We concluded that the state of Minnesota, through the Department of Transportation, has a very technical process of making those assessments, and on balance, we will probably be using more asphalt than concrete, but it depends on the circumstances.
Asphalt's cheaper, concrete lasts longer.
That's true, and when you're dealing with a fixed amount of money, sometimes what you have to spend will determine that. Whatever they use, I just wish we could have fewer potholes. I don't think I have ever been as frustrated driving around the streets of St. Paul or elsewhere in the state of Minnesota as I have been, and I'm sure that many of your viewers feel the same.
Well, I can tell you that road down John Ireland is got to be high on the list, from what I can tell.
There are many that compete with that one, believe me.
So do you need a special kind of background to do the evaluation work? Because that's not really necessarily. This is a gross overgeneralization, and I'm not allowed to do numbers, so I'm probably the wrong guy to say this. But you need a different kind of background maybe to do evaluation work than you do to determine whether or not funds have been properly spent.
Oh, you're absolutely correct. It's a different set of skills and background. And so, for example, in our financial audit division, we hire mostly accountants and CPAs. But on our program evaluation side, we hire people with a diverse background in the social sciences, the law, economics. They do have to be very good researchers. They have to be able to get into complicated topics quickly, concentrate and learn their subject matter, and be able to then write a fairly detailed and lengthy report that will serve the interests of a general audience. We do sometimes get into issues that are technical and complicated, and we need to hire consultants. And we did that, for example, on looking at concrete versus asphalt. We needed to hire some engineers.
So let's go back to the MNsure and let's program here and talk a little bit about, in general, what kinds of things would you be looking, I mean, from a process or procedure standpoint, would you be looking at there?
Well, certainly one of the things we will focus a good deal of attention on is the development of the website. That's been the source of most of the frustration of citizens being told through this very, very extensive advertising that we did, that on October 1, 2013, you could come to this website, MNsure website, and you could shop for insurance. And I think we also have to remember that this was a situation in which the citizens of this nation were told, you have to have insurance. It's a government mandate. And so I think we were venturing to some degree into new territory, both in federal law and then by mandating that people have to buy a product. And I know that was very controversial and ultimately
there's some legal issues there
and ultimately settled by a decision of the United States Supreme Court, which was itself quite controversial. But anyway, aside from that, what we did to implement the law is we said we are going to go, and I know some people may be cringe at me saying this, but I think it's a fair and accurate characterization that we in government were going to go into the online shopping business, that we were going to create a shopping experience online. And many people are doing that in all kinds of websites, whether it's Amazon.com or whatever, booking their travel tickets. And so people have now an expectation of what that experience is like. It's supposed to be seamless, easy, and it wasn't for many people. And so we need to examine very carefully what went wrong, how well the vendors that were involved were managed, how well the state responded when the problems occurred. But we'll look at other things as well. But there's going to be a lot of focus on that aspect of MNsure.
We'll no doubt have a chance to come back to that. I suspect our viewers may have questions about that. But let's expand the conversation a little bit here and talk about your experience over the last several decades. And are there one or more of these investigations, evaluations that you've conducted, or maybe financial audits for that matter, that really stand out as you're looking back over your experience and time in this area?
Well, you know, there's always the routine work, and I think that's important. I think just to have, you know, an institutionalized mechanism in state government where auditing oversight is routine. But you asked me about ones that I really remember and stand out for any particular reason, and there are two. One was an investigation that I was asked to do early in the Pawlenty administration. There were very serious allegations being made about a settlement that the Commissioner of Commerce made with an insurance company. And the allegation was that there was what was characterized as a sweetheart deal in the settlement because this company had made a campaign contribution to the Pawlenty for Governor campaign. There was a lot of heated rhetoric and discussion around the Capitol. There were allegations from the then Attorney General toward the governor. And it appeared to many people that we just weren't really getting to the facts. There were a lot of allegations, a lot of rhetoric, but not a lot of facts. And so I was asked to use my authority and to investigate. And I was concerned because it was a very politically volatile situation. And one of the things that I have had to think about is that I do not want my office, the Office of the Legislative Auditor, to be misused. We do have significant authority. We can subpoena people, and we do. And so we can have a real impact on people's lives, particularly in the political environment. And so I do not want the office in any way to be used for a politically motivated investigation. And so what I decided to do was make sure that going in, we would have a mandate, so to speak, from all the parties on both sides of the aisle. So basically, I wrote myself a letter, and I said, Mr. Nobles, these issues have been raised. They haven't been settled. They need to be addressed. Would you please conduct an investigation and lay out the facts? And I wrote that letter to myself, and then at the bottom, I wanted the signatures of the Republicans in the Senate, the Democrats in the Senate, the leadership, and on the House as well. And I wanted the signature of the governor. And so I said, this is really important, getting into this investigation, that there's no perception that there's a political motivation. We'll deal with ensuring that the facts are laid out in the report in the end. But I think in this case, it's particularly important in the beginning that we establish that this is a bipartisan request, not politically motivated. So that's one that, always stands out as a significant experience of trying to protect the independence of the office in a way that I think is really important. And, you know, we are sort of this island of nonpartisan work in the midst of a very partisan environment. And so you really have to kind of learn how to navigate through that to protect the integrity and independence of the office. Quickly, another one that comes to mind is the Metro Gang Strike Force. There were serious allegations about that police organization, and I was actually asked by the Commissioner of Public Safety at the time to conduct an investigation. There was not any real political issue involved in that, but whenever you're going to investigate the police, you're taking on something that's a pretty serious matter. And we did that. We found some very serious problems. We actually turned over our report and our evidence to the FBI, who followed up on that investigation. There were prosecutions. So that was one that I remember very distinctly, because I think that, you know, government has a lot of power to do a lot of things. And we always have to be very careful of how that power is used. But there's no organization in government that really has more power than the police. They have guns and badges that can be used for good, and they can be used for things that are inappropriate. And we found that, in fact, in that case, they were being used for things that were inappropriate. And as a result of our investigation, that unit of police force was shut down. Was something that frankly concerned me a great deal, because there's a real problem with gangs, and we need to have strong police presence to address that issue. So it wasn't with any great pleasure that I saw the consequence of that investigation, but I thought it was important that we ensure that the police powers were being used appropriately.
It would come as no surprise to the founders who gave us our Constitution and separation of powers and form of government that men and women are imperfect. It is true of justices, it's true of auditors, it's true of police officers, it's true of all of us. And there's a check and balance function that your office performs that isn't necessarily a constitutional power, but is nonetheless part of that whole conversation.
Very much so. In fact, I think Justice Anderson, is one of the things that has always kept me working at this and in government. I've always felt very privileged to be a part of the basic principles that are embedded in our Constitution. I know sometimes people think that's a little high-minded of me, you know, kind of the green eye-shade auditors all of a sudden talking about the Constitution. But from the very day I went to work at the legislature, I really felt strongly that every day I was working on things that mattered, because they were the basic fundamental principles of our democracy. And one of those is separation of powers, checks and balances. And so, another one that I care a great deal about is due process. One of the things I was able to work on early in my career at the legislature was something called the Administrative Procedures Act, where the executive branch takes on sort of a quasi-legislative function of being able to promulgate rules that have the force and effect of law. And yet they need to have very strong due process to be able to have that authority. And so, again, it's why I keep working at it, because I think it's important.
That subject alone deserves some time. The rise of the administrative state and how we deal with that is not, that question has not been fully explored and resolved. And we'll have time to do that, I suspect, in the future. So we have a question from a viewer in Lakeville who wants to revisit a little piece of history. This viewer says, I know it may be difficult, but perhaps the auditor could talk about the audit of the state lottery in the early 2000s and what resulted. It might be tough, and we all know why it was tough, among other things, but it might be good for Minnesotans to hear about this.
Well, I appreciate the question, although I must admit it is one of the most difficult situations that I've ever experienced in my career, and still difficult at times to even remember what happened. We were asked to conduct an evaluation in this case of the state lottery. We had already conducted a number of audits over the years. And as a part of that, we found a number of things that were concerning in the relationships that the director of the lottery had with certain vendors that he had under contract. I didn't think they rose to certainly any level of criminality, but they were concerns that we were raising. And so at the end of that evaluation, we met with the executive director and his staff, and I remember it was a long and a very frank discussion, and I could tell that he was concerned, and so we left the meeting together. I'd known George for many years, had respect for him, thought he had done a good job in many ways, but I knew he had some questions that he would have to answer. But I remember the last thing I said to him is that, George, I think you'll be able to work your way through this as long as you face the problems, and people have a lot of respect for you, and they're going to give you a lot of latitude to face these and deal with them. But they are going to expect you to do that straight ahead, straight on. Well, the next morning, I got a call that he had committed suicide, and it was a consequence, that I did not anticipate. Who could? And it's one that I have revisited many times, but I have no regrets that we did our job professionally and appropriately. I don't know what else was going on in his life that caused him to take that action, but obviously it was tragic, and it was truly the darkest day of my career.
We have a question about the intersection of your duties with the public. I mean, you talked a little bit about your legislative responsibilities. Talk a little bit about how you interact with the public and whether the public gives you some input from time to time.
Absolutely. Even though I'm not an elected official, I feel a very strong responsibility to the public, generally and individually. And so if anybody wants to call me, walk in my office with a concern, an issue, I'm willing to take it and deal with it. And in fact, we do receive quite a few allegations and concerns by citizens by various means. We take everyone in, we log them, we do what we call a preliminary assessment to determine whether or not we're going to follow up with an investigation or an audit or whatever we're going to do to try to address the issue. One of the things that often concerns me is that people come to us after they've had experiences with other agencies trying to resolve a problem and become very frustrated. For example, during the situation with Mensure, I had many phone calls, many letters, emails from citizens expressing their frustration, their concern, asking for help. Please, I need to get insurance. I'm required to get insurance. And so we do what we can to be responsive. And so I would encourage anybody that's out there that has an issue that they think ought to be investigated, audited, please bring it forth, because we will address it. Sometimes the result is not what people necessarily anticipate. People may think that there is a problem, and we look at the facts and make a different judgment. But we will be serious about every concern that is brought to us.
How does that work internally? Do you make the call, or does it go to your commission, or is there? I mean, how do you make a decision about whether it's up or down on conducting a more detailed investigation?
I would say most of the time I make that call, but there are a few occasions. One of them, for example, I mentioned with the Pawlenty administration. That was already a very visible one. But if I receive an allegation that I think deserves some attention from the Legislative Audit Commission for a variety of reasons, I may bring it to their attention and ask for their judgment. The one thing that I've always felt strongly about is to protect the independence of the legislative auditor. I would not accept being told not to look at something. If I feel that there is a problem that needs to be addressed in an independent, thorough, nonpartisan way, I'm going to use the authority that I have in law to do that. There are sometimes some gray areas where some guidance from the legislature could be helpful. And I've worked out a relationship with the Legislative Audit Commission members over the years where we, I think, understand together how this authority and office needs to be used. And oftentimes, after we've had a discussion about an issue, they may simply say, Jim, we're going to trust your judgment on that. You decide. I know, for example, that occurred a couple of years ago when we were asked to look at some issues related to the Attorney General. And I felt, given again the visibility of that office, it really needed to be something that was brought to the attention of the Commission. They certainly understood that they did not want to take a position to say, don't look at it, but they felt uncomfortable saying, yes, do. So they left it to my judgment. And
what call did you make?
You know, I did quite a bit of work, issued a report. I found that the problems that were being alleged that were very internal in the personnel activities within the Attorney General's office. Really, I could not substantiate many of the allegations. And so we closed that up and went forward.
I suppose I should do my due diligence here, a term that you know well. You mentioned the investigation early on in the Pawlenty administration. What was the result of all of that?
Oh, yes. Well, we could not, again, substantiate the allegation that there was any relationship between the campaign contribution and the settlement. So that was kind of the heart of the matter. But interestingly, it was later determined that the campaign contribution that had been made was illegal. And the insurance company was indicted. The officers of the company were indicted, and ultimately they paid a significant fine. As I recall, it was, and this was adjudicated in a court, that they paid $1 million.
So let's talk a little bit about, you know, these are big cases. These are the kinds of things that,
Right.
that you know, we read about in the newspaper, and the legislative auditor gets his picture plastered all across the first page of the B section of the Star Tribune, or its equivalent in St. Paul. But my guess is you also are working on things that are maybe important to participants but aren't perhaps as well known. Can you give us some examples of maybe some interesting work that you've seen in those areas that maybe the public hasn't heard much about?
Oh, sure. Again, a lot of the work we're doing is just the routine aspects of government. I think of one that we're just finishing up at the Department of Natural Resources, where we went into the department to determine whether or not the department was using all of their various dedicated funds according to the law. One of the really complicated things about government, which sometimes people don't fully appreciate or understand, that makes it sometimes, I think, more complicated than the private sector. We have many strings attached to the money that the legislature appropriates, particularly what we call dedicated money, whether it's constitutionally dedicated or dedicated by statute. And so there sometimes will be, out of, let's say, the Game and Fish Fund, a lot of specifics on how that money can and cannot be used. So we might go in and just did, in fact, go in and do kind of a regular audit just to make sure that money is being used according to the law. We did the same sort of audit recently with general obligation bonds. Again, a lot of strings attached, both constitutional, statutory, bond council opinions. That money can be used for some things, but not other things. And so it takes a very detailed, in-depth kind of examination of exactly how was the money used. Was it used appropriately to state constitution and statutory law?
So, in terms of your specific findings, you know, are there sort of systemic kinds of changes that you look at the way state government is organized, and does it lead you to conclusions or to recommendations about how perhaps budgeting matters should be handled? Let me give you an example. On the federal level, for years there's been a debate about whether or not, to the extent you can get the Congress of the United States to pass a budget, the House and Senate to do so, that maybe it should be two-year budgets and not single-year budgets. Right. Do you get involved in those kinds of questions?
You know, it's a good question because we don't really get involved a lot in the budget process itself. Our work kind of comes after the appropriations. But every once in a while, we are asked to look at some aspect of that budgeting process. And I remember just a couple of years ago, we were asked to look at something that is a very sort of internal part, but an important part of the legislative process, and it's referred to as a fiscal note. And that is, whenever a legislator proposes a bill, there's supposed to be an assessment, an estimate of how much will that cost. And there was quite a bit of controversy about whether or not those were accurate, how were those being arrived at. And so we looked at that process, but that's more the exception. I would say we're pretty much out of that the budgeting process. Our work really starts after the appropriation occurs. So, for example, with our so-called GO bonds, the general obligation bonds, the actual revenue was appropriated several years ago, and then the projects are in process, and we're out there some years later determining whether or not the money was spent appropriately and legally.
All right, question from a viewer in Becker wants to know, does the auditor get involved in questions like whether the war on drugs has proven to be effective, and if the state's getting a good investment on those kinds of policies?
To some degree we do, because effectiveness, impact, is really the heart of an evaluation. Sometimes it's difficult to answer those questions. But absolutely, I mean, specifically on drug issues, I know we've done a number of evaluations, and I think it's useful to illustrate that one of the reasons we get asked is that sometimes there are claims and counterclaims about the effectiveness of a particular program. The state of Minnesota spends a lot of money on not only the war on drugs in the police sense of that, but on trying to solve drug addiction problems through treatment. And there is often a debate in the legislature, are these programs effective or not? And one of the things that can be confusing in those kinds of debates is that you have advocates on both sides of the question. You'll have advocates bring forth studies that say all that money you're spending on drug treatment isn't effective because, you know, maybe 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 people really aren't successfully treated. And then you'll have other advocates come in with other studies that say quite the opposite. So sometimes legislators come to us just saying, as an independent party here who isn't an advocate of either point of view, could you go off, review the literature, do your own kind of testing, research, and come back with us and tell us, are these programs effective or not? What's interesting in that particular case, because, you know, it's presented to legislators as either or. And what you often find is that it's a little more complicated than that when you really do the research. And so what I came back with was some programs are effective sometimes with some people, which is an important thing to know, because then your task administering the program is to find out which program will be effective with what sorts of people, with what sorts of addictions, when. And so it becomes a more complicated and nuanced challenge to find effectiveness.
We're seeing this in the judicial branch, not only here but around the country right now, with what we call problem solving or drug courts. And there is actually beginning to develop a fairly impressive body of evidence that they are effective. but not all programs and not for all kinds of individuals. And it's a more complicated question than people might assume.
And maybe not the first time. I mean, another one of the complications is, and I think we probably know this from many of the histories that we've heard in looking at this situation, is that sometimes it's the fourth or the fifth effort at treatment that works. And so, again, it's a kind of a methodological issue for the evaluator. When do you make that judgment that there was success or failure?
You know, there's this concept of confirmation bias. I mean, where you go looking for the answer that you expect to find. And how do you guard against that, so that you're getting a result? I mean, there are no guarantees, of course, no result's perfect. But how do you guard against the? We went out and found what we thought was the answer, and it was what we thought it was all along.
Right. Well, it's very important because I would say our two principal goals for every report is that they're accurate and objective. And if they're going to be objective, you have to clear your mind of any bias. And you have to design your methodology and your whole research process with that in mind, that your ultimate goal that you have to achieve to have any credibility is that you are going to be objective without bias. So one of the ways we do that is it's in the nature of the people we hire, and they are skilled, experienced researchers who don't come there with an agenda, with any particular advocacy of an interest.
And they are as nonpartisan as you are. I mean, that's the requirement of the office.
I insist on that, and not only do I insist on it, it is really part of the tradition of the audit industry and evaluation industry. For example, for every assignment that any staff person in my office is given, they must fill out a very extensive, what we refer to as an independence questionnaire. And they have to reveal a lot of things, very personal things about their associations, their family relationships, their experiences, that might in any way, in reality or perception, cause somebody to think that they were not independent. So with somebody doing an evaluation of drug treatment, you know, if you've ever worked for a vendor of drug treatment, you wouldn't work on that evaluation. Frankly, it might even be the case that if you had been through drug treatment, that
or some close family member,
or
perhaps.
some close family member. So we require that as a part of every assignment for every person that works, and I submit I do those independence questionnaires myself. But we also, and it's important to say, that we are very collaborative. I don't send out just one person to work. It's going to be a team, and it's going to go through a process. And let's say it's a two-person, three-person team. They're going to go out and do the research. They're going to write a draft report. I'm going to review it. And then I'm going to put another evaluator who's never worked on that, who's going to go through the work papers and verify to source documents that what we're saying is accurate and objective. So there is an internal quality control that has to be there. And then, frankly, once we have the draft, there is a certain amount of external review with experts, with people in the programs, and so if they see bias, if they see words that they think might suggest any inappropriate choice, or we deal with that. So with that final goal being accuracy and objectivity, we have to have a very rigorous process to achieve that. It's the foundation of our credibility.
I may come back to that, but we've got another question from a viewer in Bloomington who wants to know whether or not your office has been involved. Now, we may have some confirmation bias here. This viewer wants to know whether or not you've conducted any investigation as to how big a boondoggle spending public money on stadiums is. I think that the viewer's got a view on this, and so we'll ask the auditor, have you been involved in investigating any of those kinds of questions?
Well, we've never taken on that exact question. Because that really was a policy choice of the legislature, and it took many years and a lot of debate and a lot of controversy and very divided opinion, frankly, whether that's good policy or not. We've actually done a fair number of evaluations of economic development policies, and many people sell building sports stadiums on the basis of economic development. So we're well aware of some of the issues involved, whether that really creates jobs or whether it simply displaces people from other kinds of jobs and spending patterns. So we're aware of those issues, but we were never asked directly to evaluate whether building, I assume this is a reference to maybe the Viking Stadium.
Well, it could be any one of number. As our viewer
do have
notes, the
quite
viewer
a few.
wants to know whether or not stadia is the correct plural, and I will say to the viewer, the Latin would say stadia is appropriate, and we have had more than one. So,
But I will just add, Justice Anderson, that although we did not address the policy question, we are, in fact, the auditors of the Metropolitan Sports Authority, and so we are currently conducting an audit as construction is ongoing for the new stadium.
so as someone who has looked at, in the course of my prior life as a practicing lawyer, lots of reports from expert witnesses, you send an issue out to have an expert look at it, and on more than one occasion, you don't get the answer back maybe that you might have expected. And without getting into expectations and so forth, are there results of your evaluations that you can think of that were surprising, that you didn't maybe expect it to go in a certain direction, and now you've done this investigation, and lo and behold, it turns out maybe to have gone in a direction that wasn't expected?
Well, I certainly know that we have found things that the people that asked us to do the evaluation were surprised by. In fact, I had a legislator just recently tell me that one of the evaluations, which did frankly have a little bit of sensitivity because of the politics of it, it had to do with looking at what's referred to as the fair share that a person has to pay if they are employed in a unit of government where they don't want to join the union, but the union represents those employees. They have to pay what is called a fair share. And there were concerns about how that fair share money was being calculated and used, and certain expectations by some legislators of what we would find. And according to the legislator that I spoke to, we didn't find what they expected. So I didn't necessarily myself have any expectation. I just wanted to find the facts.
Well, and this is, I mean, that of course is part of the reason why you do this, is because you do get a request for an investigation. Let's talk a little bit about the numbers side of things. We've talked about program evaluations. I think the public's really interested in whether programs are effective or not, and we may come back to that. But what do you typically find when you do what we would consider to be a traditional financial audit? Are there sort of patterns that if you're going to see a problem that you would typically see?
You know, we have a lot of findings about what we call internal controls, because the one thing you want in government, I think you want it in a corporation as well, are strong internal controls that prevent problems from happening. Mm-hmm. And so we look at that a lot. And there's a pattern of those not being as strong as they need to be. They're there. Generally we will find, we will conclude that they're generally adequate, and then it'll be followed by, however, we found these problems. And so certainly perfection is hardly ever achieved. And so I do think that there is this pattern that we find that we need to strengthen internal controls. Another thing I would say is common, and it comes with the nature of government, and that is we haven't done as good a job as we need to do on what is referred to as eligibility determinations. If people want to understand why government is so complicated, and it is very complicated, it is because almost every program has eligibility determinations. And it is what separates, to go back to the point about MNsure, because many people expected, I think maybe even I expected, that, gosh, if people can create online shopping experiences like Amazon.com, we can do that. But if you go out as a consumer to buy on Amazon.com, there's no eligibility determination for your purchase. It's just, do you have a credit card to pay for it? But if you go on MNsure, and one of the complications and difficulties of building MNsure was this very elaborate, complicated computer networking system that had to be built to determine eligibility determinations, to decide, are you eligible for Medicaid? Are you eligible for Minnesota Care? Are you eligible for the tax subsidy that will come with a commercial product? Those are very complex determinations. They don't have just to be with yes, no. It's many, many different factors. So we find, I think, a pattern of government needing to do a better job It's not easy, but that's what we advocate for a lot.
You know, we've got a question from a viewer at St. Paul about dedicated funding. And over the years, I've had conversations with legislators about, this business about whether you should have dedicated funding or whether the legislature should be in charge. And so this viewer's question is, particularly the DNR, is dedicating funding the best way to fund natural resources? We have lottery money and sales tax money with legacy, and our citizens getting the best bang for their buck. And of course, the advantages are obvious, gives better funding for programs, but it creates other issues because, as we've seen in times of budget cutbacks, some programs are actually flush with resources. Other programs have little to none. What about that? Is that an issue you've looked at? Or?
I think we're touching on probably the two things that I think make government incredibly complicated. I just touched on one, and that is eligibility determination. Who's eligible for what? But the other one is this ever-present issue of dedicated funding. And I alluded to it earlier in one of the audits that we're looking at. And the reason we're doing that audit is because DNR, the Department of Natural Resources, probably more than any other agency in state government, but not the only one by any means, has so many different pots of money. I mean, they have a pot of money just for, if I'm recalling correctly, just to maintain turkey habitat. Mm-hmm. So if you've got a certain amount of money that people paid into that fund by buying maybe a turkey hunting stamp, mm-hmm. or I don't hunt turkeys myself, so I don't quite know what that is, but I know there are many different kinds of dedicated pots of money for different kinds of animals and habitat. And so if you've got a conservation officer out there working in the field, you've got to make a determination, did he spend those 2 hours on working on turkey habitat and not deer habitat? Or so it really complicates government a lot. But the people of Minnesota, I think, have decided through their legislators, there's a strong turkey lobby, by the way. But they decided by a constitutional amendment that they wanted more dedicated funds by passing the legacy amendment. That created 4 special dedicated funds that the agencies have to keep track of separately, that we as auditors have to audit, again, to maintain that you're not spending money from this pot of money on something that should be spent. You should be spending money out of that pot of money. Mm-hmm. So it really complicates the administration of government greatly. But again, that's the decision of the people's elected representatives and sometimes of the people themselves through a direct vote.
Viewer from Brainerd wants to ask a related question. Can the state legislative auditor talk about his investigation into the constitutional dedicated legacy funds of a couple of years ago?
Yes, we are doing at least one audit of one of the legacy funds every year, and I felt strongly about that. Even though it does make government more complicated, it makes, frankly, our work more complicated. I feel, again, a responsibility to the people of the state of Minnesota who voted to have these 4 funds. And so I consider my job is to fulfill that mandate, that we spend money that goes into that pot on the things that the Constitution said are supposed to be developed out of that money. And so we are doing work, and we are finding that it's very challenging and complicated. One of the big issues with legacy money that we've had to deal with is not only are we spending them out of the right fund, but how much are we spending on administration? Because I think there was an expectation, not always real clearly stated, but an expectation nonetheless, that we did not want to use this new money that was coming in from the legacy amendment to just support the bureaucracy, so to speak. That the people really wanted something above and beyond what we were already doing. And yet, there has to be some amount of money to administer the programs that are funded out of the legacy money. There's just a hope and an expectation that we will keep that as low as possible.
Were there any specific findings in that investigation that our viewers might find of interest? I mean, other than perhaps some of the more minor issues, anything in particular that we should bring to their attention?
Well, actually, I would encourage your viewers to go on our website, and there is an evaluation report that we did on the legacy amendment itself. We wanted to sort of take a broad view, and we did lay out a number of issues that we felt were going to be ongoing issues and concerns about the legacy amendment and the utilization of that money. And one of them was administrative expense. But another one, which is a provision that's in the Constitution itself, which says that this new legacy money is supposed to be used to supplement what we're already doing and not substitute for traditional funding. Determining what is traditional funding. Is it what happened last year? Is it what has happened over 10 years? Is very unclear. And so that report in particular, I would recommend to people as kind of laying out what I consider going to be the continuing challenges. Another one that we mentioned in that report is something that is a challenge that we feel as an evaluation audit office.
About 20 seconds.
And that is to determine what ultimately did we get for the money we've spent. And so what are the outcomes going to be?
Well, I want to thank you, Mr. Nobles, for joining us today. It's been great to have you with us. I want to thank our viewers for participating, and I want to tell you that next week's program is going to be very special as well. We're going to have with us Governor Dayton's 2 appointments to the Minnesota Supreme Court, Justice Wilhelmina Wright and Justice David Lillehawk. And they will be joining us to talk about their work on their court, the experiences they've had over the last year or so. And we want to invite you to participate in that program. Unfortunately, we will not be live next week. So if you've got questions for our 2 newest members of the court, I invite you to send them in electronically or via the telephone number that we've given you, and we'll see that they get to our guests next week. Of course, same rules as tonight. We won't be able to talk about pending matters, but we can have a pretty good discussion about policy and procedure and their experiences. Again, Mr. Nobles, thank you for joining us. Thank you, the viewers, for being with us. We look forward to seeing you all next week.
There's much more about your legislators online at pioneer.org. Find out more about the history of the program, who's been a guest, and watch all our past episodes. There's also a photo gallery, informative links, and much more. You can also get involved and stay in touch by following us on Twitter and join the discussion on our Facebook page. Thank you for watching Your Legislators. Your Legislators is made possible in part by the generous financial support of MAPE members, making Minnesota clean waters, safe communities, quality education, and veterans care happen. We work hard for Minnesotans.